we do have a special guest today, and joining us coming up here in a minute will be Dominic Amore. He is the author of the book A Franchise on the Rise, First 20 Years of the Yankees. He's a columnist for the Hartford Courant. Hopefully I pronounced that right. Since 1988, he has done coverage for the Yankees over the years, and he still does coverage of the minor league baseball team, the Yard Goats, and Yukon Sports. He's a four-time winner of the Sports Writers Association for the state's best writer, and we are going to bring him in and say good morning. Dominic, good morning. How are you today, sir?
Good morning, guys. How are you? Nice to be with you.
Good morning.
It's good to have you, and we appreciate you taking some time out of your day to come and join us, and we will get right into it because I know we have a lot of questions. And I can tell you the truth, Mac did not put that book there just because you're coming on. If you look at any tape, it's always there, I promise you.
Well, I appreciate it. I always have my copy on handy for Zoom calls and
very
the like. So
very nice. He's always got it. I don't want to, if he didn't, I would tell you on the air just to mess with you. So I guess I'll start off. My first question, really, because, I know a lot about the current stuff, so any information I can get about the stuff I don't know is great. Yeah. How many different names did the Yankees discuss before settling on the Yankees, and what was the final factor in that decision?
Well, in those days, teams didn't necessarily have, official names the way they do today. It was kind of like a word of mouth thing. So their official name, much like the Mets, as you know, their official name is actually the Metropolitan Baseball Club of New York. And, the Yankees, as an entry in the new league that had formed a couple of years earlier, they were the American League. They were the New York American League Baseball Club. So a lot of people called them the Americans because they were in the American League. That was common throughout the country in cities that had two leagues. The American League team would be the Americans, the National League team would be the Nationals. So they were called that. They were called in some cases. So they were often called by the owners. So the owner was named Bill Devery, and they were called the Deveryites. That was another one of their names. But they played. Their ballpark was built on the highest point in Manhattan, on 168th and Broadway, where New York Presbyterian is today. So they were also very commonly called the Highlanders, obviously. And that's the name that we know. We think of them as the Highlanders. That's most common. But there was they didn't have, their uniforms didn't say Highlanders, and there was no logo with an H on it or a peak on it or anything like that. So that was more of a word of mouth thing. But that didn't go, the newspapers didn't like it because it was too long, didn't fit in headlines. There are issues with that. So the first opening day in 1903 had a big patriotic display, which was not typical at that time. There were flags all over the Hilltop Park. There were flags of a lot of different countries planted on the field for the ceremonies because of New York's history of immigrants. So they try to represent everyone. So there was. Because of this, they were somewhat associated with patriotism, and of course, the Yankees being a name for Americans overseas. So even as early as 1904, newspapers started calling them the Yankees informally. So they were known kind of as all these different things, and they really didn't have a fan base, believe it or not, because the Giants really owned New York and the Dodgers owned Brooklyn. But when they hired Frank Chance away from the Cubs to manage them in 1913, he came up with the idea that they should have no nickname. They had never won anything, and he said that they should just have no nickname because they hadn't earned one. The Giants earned the Giants nickname because they're always winning. The Yankee owners rejected that out of hand because by now more formal nicknames were becoming the thing. So after they moved out of Hilltop Park and they started to rent the Polo Grounds in 1913, that's when they officially became the Yankees. So they didn't really have a name. I think history is kind of records them as the Highlanders, although you rarely see that referenced at the time. So they kind of, at one point, the 7 different papers in New York would call them 7 different things. So they had a whole lot of different names.
They should do a Highlanders throwback day one day at Yankee Stadium or something. Dress them up like the Highlanders, let them run it again. Now, one of the most iconic symbols in all of sports across the planet is the one right here on my hat, the interlocking symbol representing the New York Yankees. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the symbol, where it came from, why it was established, the reason behind it?
Yeah, it goes back to 1879. Actually, it was it was created by Tiffany. Tiffany designed it, and it became a badge, or it became a symbol for New York policemen who were killed in the line of duty. And they were awarded a medal with that logo on it. Now the Yankees or the Highlanders, or whatever we want to call them, didn't start using it until 1909. Their first 6 years, they would just have a plain block N and Y, usually an N on one breast and a Y on the other, and their hats would have nothing. Then in 1909. One of the owners, again, was a former New York police chief, and I guess he didn't need copyrights or permission or anything like that in those days. And he appropriated that interlocking NY with that style and used it, began using it on the jersey and eventually on the hats a couple of years later. And it's interesting. The Yankees haven't changed their uniforms really since 1921 or so, or 20, or I guess in the late 30s they added the NY on the chest. But in the early days they had a different uniform every year. Usually whatever the style was.
I love it.
Well, Dom, we all talk about spring training. Today how they have their fields and everything. But one manager had a unique spring training at least one year that I know of.
Yeah.
But he actually had a plantation down in Georgia where he would harvest his crops, and he decided, if I'm right, to bring down the players for some spring training and kind of help them out at the same time. Can you kind of tell us about that?
Yeah, well, you can imagine what the Players Association would say about this arrangement today. It probably wouldn't fly. But George Stallings, he's better known in history as the guy who managed the Braves in 1914 when they went from last on July 4th to winning the World Series. But he got a job managing the Yankees in 1909. And what had happened was his family had lost their farm in the Reconstruction period. And when he got into baseball, his goal was to buy it back. So little by little, he made a little bit more money, and he bought a little more of the land that his family used to own. And when he got hired by the Yankees in 1909, it put him over the top, and he had bought back the entire farm in Haddock, Georgia. So he was trying to get that going again. So he got this idea that he would bring not the best players on the team, obviously, because they would probably have had none of it, but all the guys who were trying to make the team and make an impression, maybe 20 or 25 of them. He brought them down, and he cleared out land so that they could play games on his farm. But then he would also have them get in shape by tilling the fields and pushing the plows and working on the field during the game. So again, you could just now, of course, obviously they stayed. He had a lot of rooms there, and they were able to stay there and live there. But you can imagine what that would have been like today. But one of the players had pitched for the Hartford minor league team the year before, a guy by the name of Pete Wilson. And he was writing the sports editor of the Hartford Courant with every so often with accounts of this bizarre goings on. And he would write little descriptions of what they were doing, that they tilled the fields on this day, and then they went to this open space and they played, and they would play games against the people that Stallings had working on his farm. And at that point, again, these are the days of segregated baseball. He had a lot of African American workers on his farm, and they would play. And you know, that probably was not even legal in Georgia at that time,
Right.
with you know
Right.
the Jim Crow laws. And this Pete Wilson would write back to the Current about how talented, how good these African American players were. This is in 1909, and that they were good enough to be playing. That some, he actually said that Hartford should sign some of them to
Yeah.
play,
Wow.
which, you know, so long before. And you know, when researching this book, these are stories that were, you know, that they were kind of they're lost in the pages of the different newspapers that they appeared in. And now today that you can search a lot of newspapers by database, you find a lot of stories that you say, "Wow, why was this forgotten?" You know,
Right.
Right.
so that's one of them. This bizarre experiment of pre-spring training at his farm was kind of lost, and probably a good idea, because I don't think it was a very good idea. But ultimately, they moved on from there to have their spring training in Macon, and the Yankees moved around quite a bit with their spring training.
Cool.
Very nice. Very nice. Let me ask you, and this is something that I did not know until somebody told me a few days ago. Maybe you could confirm this for me. So the sources told me that the Yankees were the first team to have spring training outside the country. Is that true? And if so, where did it take place?
Well, they had spring training in Bermuda.
Wow.
Yeah, this was a little bit later on in 1918, but they had spring training there, or rather 1917.
What led them there? How'd that happen?
You know what? The owner, one of the owners, Frank Farrell, I think knew somebody, and they got a deal. You know, they were always on the cheap, those original owners, and they cleared off these massive cricket grounds where they played cricket, and they had spring training there. And but what happened was, you know, the weather obviously there was now. Remember, they didn't really train in Florida at this time. They didn't train. If they did, they trained in Jacksonville. It was about as far south as they got. So the weather was warm, but it wasn't really tropical warm. And when they went out and they played out there, actually I take it back. It was 1913, and it was Frank Chance. When they trained out in Bermuda, they all raved about how incredible the weather was. It was 80 degrees and warm every day. And when they came back, their first game in Boston, it was about 40 degrees.
Oh.
And both of the starting pitchers, their starting pitcher, Ray Caldwell, and the Red Sox starting pitcher, Smokey Joe Wood, both injured their arms on opening day. And they blamed, the Yankees at least blamed the fact that they had trained in 80-degree weather and weren't ready for the
Cold
Northeast. Yeah, and so they never went back there again. But of course, you know, today they're in Tampa, and they realize there are ways to mitigate that.
Right,
Yep.
right.
Hal Stanbrander Field down there off I-4, off 75 there.